This is MichMash, a weekly conversation where we try to unjumble an important and sometimes under-the-radar statewide story that affects you. I'm Cheyna Roth.
And I'm Zach Gorchow.
Zach, we have talked a lot about the budget lately, but given that the final document was hundreds of pages, we haven't really had a chance to dive deep into it because, well, even for a fast reader, going through all of that takes time. But today, we're going to dig into the details a lot with our guest, State Budget Director Jen Flood. Director Flood will be joining us later in the show.
Before we get to our interview with Director Flood, let's talk about an issue that was sort of playing out on the side during the budget negotiations, earmarks. The Michigan Senate this week passed a bipartisan bill to create more transparency when it comes to these items. But House Republicans are calling foul because they passed a bill with greater disclosure requirements for earmarks. This prompted a heated back and forth this week between the Republican House Speaker, Matt Hall, and the Democratic Senate Majority Leader, Winnie Brinks.
Zach, for the folks at home who might think of earmarks as that thing you do to a book to save your spot, what are earmarks in this sense?
So they go by a lot of names besides earmarks, Cheyna. Some call them enhancement grants. Some call them legislative directed spending items. Some call them projects, and many people call them pork, a pejorative term that derives from the idea of legislators bringing home the bacon, aka statewide taxpayer dollars, to their districts. So some of these items are what the public probably associates with earmarks and pork. Money for a new local fire station, money for a new bridge, tangible things that are built that you can see. But some of these earmarks through the years go to organizations to carry out a specific function. And some of these have completely embarrassed the state, to put it mildly. There's the Global Link controversy. We've talked about that. There was the Compete Health Park item. Both of these were big scandals involving millions of dollars, and they're both the subject of criminal investigations. There's a long list of projects that just made you wonder, who is getting rich off this deal?
This is all tie-barred to the House bill you mentioned, meaning both would have to pass and be signed by Governor Whitmer to become law. Both the House and Senate bills would create earmark transparency rules, and these rules should be familiar to lawmakers because theoretically, they already agreed to them during the final stretch of the most recent budget cycle that we're all still trying to recover from. So, Zach, let's start with what these bills would do before we sink more into the drama of all this.
So 50,000 foot level, the idea is let's set the rules on how earmarks are to work before the next budget process, as opposed to building the plane in the air, which is what they did this time, where they were figuring out earmarks rules while trying to finalize the budget too. So in terms of the specific bills, the one from the House Republicans is pretty rigorous. Legislators who want to sponsor an earmark would have to publicly disclose the proposal essentially no later than April 1, 90 days before the statutory deadline for a budget, and 180 days before the new fiscal year starts. There's also a minimum 14-day threshold for the item to be publicly disclosed before a passage vote in the legislature in case the budget moves much earlier or there's a supplemental budget bill outside of the regular process. And then there's also language to assure earmarks don't go to these fly-by-night entities, a couple of which I was referring to earlier, that are formed just to get a state grant and to avoid legislator self-dealing to get some of the money.
The Senate bill bars earmarks to for-profit entities. It requires legislators to submit a request for an earmark at least 10 days before a final passage vote, so not as much time as the House bill. There's also language to limit the ability of top legislative leaders to request grants outside their region, which has been a point of concern. There's also language enabling the state to reclaim funds if improperly used and requiring the state to verify recipients meet eligibility requirements before sending out the funds.
So while these bills passed pretty overwhelmingly, they are not universally beloved. Some lawmakers in the Senate attempted to pass amendments that failed. Republican Senator Jim Runstead tried to pass an amendment requiring earmarks to have a cooling off period before they're voted on, so people like reporters and the public can look at the earmarks closely. And some lawmakers just don't think the bills go far enough as they are.
And no surprise, there's a war of words on this between the Republican Speaker of the House, Matt Hall, and the Democratic Majority Leader in the Senate, Winnie Brinks. Hall is lambasting the Senate bills as weak and claiming they go back on the budget deal between him, Brinks, and the governor. Brinks is disputing that as a mischaracterization.
I feel like we were just here when it came to the budget with that kind of back and forth.
I mean, it's deja vu. It's deja
right,
vu
isn't
for
it?
Everybody.
Totally. Overall, though, if you look at the two bills, there's a lot of common ground. The Senate bill passed the Senate 31-5. That is a bona fide bipartisan vote. The House bill passed the House 108-0. Very few things, Cheyna, pass the House anymore unanimously. So despite the back and forth this week, this seems like it could get done quickly if leadership dials in. But as we saw with the budget, however, that is easier said than done.
Yeah. So we're just going to have to wait a little bit to see if they decide to stop making the pork over at the state capitol, or at least put some more limits on the pork at the state capitol.
Yeah, we'll see. It's just going to be a tough one to figure out amid all the other things. But again, there's a lot of common ground here.
All right, well, we are going to switch gears now. And after this short break, we're going to be joined by State Budget Director Jen Flood to really dig into some of the more juicy topics of the state budget. Stick around.
Welcome back. I'm Zach Gorchow. Joining us now is Jen Flood, Director of the State Budget Office. She's the governor's lead on all things budget and a veteran of state government, having worked other roles in the governor's office and government affairs in the private sector and more. Jen, welcome to MichMash.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Jen, everyone knows this was a challenging budget. But what part of this do you think was most difficult to negotiate to get this done?
We had a lot of things working against us. We had a divided legislature for the first time in 15 years. We were facing a road funding shortfall. And last summer, Congress blew $1 billion hole in our state budget with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so we had our work cut out for us, but we had parties at the table who had really clearly defined priorities and all cared about making our state a better place. So we came together and worked right up until the end. The process was challenging, but I think the outcome was good. And everyone was able to find a win-win and a win for Michiganders. And we've got, at the end of the day, a budget that includes $2 billion in road funding, which is going to protect the jobs in the construction industry. We've got record investment in kids. We're able to make sure that we draw down all of our federal Medicaid funding and make sure people maintain access to healthcare. And we're going to continue to compete for jobs and lower costs for families.
So there were a couple of just absolutely essential components to get this particular budget done. One of them was stepping up the use of money in the school aid fund, which mainly funds the state's K through 12 public schools to help fund the 15 public universities and 28 community colleges. That number is up to $1.3 billion now. It helped pave the way for the plan to boost road funding, but public school leaders are pretty hot about it. Can you address the use of an additional $400 million in the school aid fund for universities and colleges?
We've got an incredible budget for kids in the state of Michigan. This budget continues our universal pre-K program, make sure every 4-year-old in the state has access to high quality early childhood education. We're continuing free school meals for every K-12 student. That saves families $1,000 a year and the time and energy it takes to buy groceries and pack meals in the morning. And as a mom, I can personally attest to the benefits of saving time in the mornings. It invests more than $10,000 per pupil into every student across the state, which is an all-time record high. We've got additional supports for educators and making sure that we're lowering class sizes. And so at the end of the day, this is an incredible K-12 budget. It also continues our track record of really transitioning a mindset of school being K through 12 and it being more like pre-K through 14 or 16. We've got the Reconnect program and the Michigan Achievement Scholarship, which is helping tens of thousands of Michiganders access a certificate, associate's, or bachelor's degree. So we view the investment really as like across the spectrum to help support our kids, which is an investment in our future.
At the beginning of the year, in Governor Whitmer's State of the State address, she said of the state's lagging third grade reading scores, I'm quoting here, "We spend more and we get less." But then after the governor signed the budget a couple weeks ago, she touted that it contains record funding. This seems like a little bit of a disconnect. Can you explain?
Yeah, I think we need to do both things. We need to continue to invest in our kids and put more resources into the system. And we also need to make sure that we continue to improve outcomes for our kids. So we're continuing to invest in literacy. We are implementing in this budget the science of reading bills that were passed last year, which is going to make sure that we're using proven curriculum to make sure that kids are learning to read in school, which sets them up for a lifetime of success. So I wouldn't pit those two things against each other. We have to do both. We have to invest more, and we have to make sure that we're improving student outcomes, and this budget is a great step in that direction.
The new 24% wholesale tax on marijuana has really riled up the industry. There's a lot of folks saying there's no way this will raise the $420 million for roads that's been estimated, that people coming to Michigan from Illinois or Indiana or Ohio and beyond for our sort of cheaper prices will instead go elsewhere or maybe even turn to the black market. Can you address the idea that the number is wishful thinking?
Yeah, the governor proposed in February a roads plan that included a variety of revenue sources. And we've said all along that fixing the roads is going to require a mix of new revenue and some responsible cuts to state government. And that's what this final budget ended up including. It included a tax on marijuana. However, that taxation level is still lower than what we tax alcohol or tobacco. And so anytime there's changes in a market, there's going to be stakeholders who are concerned. When we looked at the taxation levels, we also looked at economic impacts to make sure that the industry is sustained. And at the end of the day, what came together was a mix of revenue and cuts. It's going to make sure that Michigan has a long-term road funding plan so that we can continue to fix roads every single year in the state.
So one of the big holdups from the budget, which you referenced at the very top, was agreeing on a roads plan. The whole thing was embedded within the budget. Is the governor's office happy with the final product? Can $1.9 billion more per year get it done when the road industry was saying the number needed was more like $3 billion?
Yeah, the House and the governor both put out plans that were $3 billion every single year. And that was before the One Big Beautiful Bill, which changed some of our context in the state by putting Medicaid funding at risk and blowing a $1 billion hole in the budget. But at the end of the day, the entire negotiation, everyone secured priorities and everyone had to give a little bit. And so the fact that we secured a $1.9 billion road funding plan in this moment is truly historic. It's the largest roads deal in Michigan's history. We're going to be able to continue investing in our state roads and highways, but we're also surging resources to local governments to fix local and neighborhood roads. So these are the roads that you take when you leave your house to drop your kids off at school or drive to work. And it's going to be record investment there that's going to make a huge difference. And it will also protect the jobs in the construction industry that have been created based on the work that we've done over the past 6 years to fix more than 24,000 lane miles across the state.
Let's talk about the state employee workforce. This budget has somewhat vague language that seems to push the state to have 80% of employees working in person to some degree. But will this mean any changes in how state employees have worked post-pandemic, largely hybrid with far less in-person work? Or is this language really just not going to change anything?
We have 50,000 state employees who work across the state hard every day on behalf of the residents. So whether it's a state trooper patrolling the highway and keeping drivers safe, a conservation officer who's out in the field in our state parks, or it's someone who works in an office building, maybe they're downtown a couple of weeks and maybe they're home a couple of days per week, we know that state employees work hard every single day. This budget includes language that's going to continue the state's efforts to consolidate and increase occupancy rates in the buildings, both in downtown Lansing and throughout the state. So we'll continue that movement to maximize occupancy and make sure that taxpayers get the best bang for their buck.
So, of course, compromises had to be made to get to a final budget. What did the governor have to give up that she was really hoping to see make it? I mean, there were a host of new spending initiatives in her February budget recommendation that did not make the final cut.
Like you mentioned, a negotiation is about compromise. Everyone had priorities that they fought really hard for. The difference between the revenues available when the governor put out her budget in February and after Congress passed the reconciliation bill this summer, our resources looked really different. And so there were a number of new proposals that we put out in February that we just didn't have the resources to pass at the end of the day. But we were able to make sure that we are investing in kids at record levels, protecting access to health care, lowering costs for families, and making sure that we have the resources to create jobs. And so we're proud of the compromise and where we ended at the end of the day.
One item that's gotten a lot of attention was the elimination of funding for the Autism Navigator program, which is about $2 million. The program provides assistance to families seeking support for children with autism and is now seeing layoffs. The speaker recently seemed to suggest this might have actually been an oversight. Is this a program that could see funding restored in a supplemental budget, or was this always the plan?
Yeah, the Autism Navigator program is really important to Michigan and families across the state, and the governor's been a supporter throughout her time in office. Some of the transparency measures that were implemented alongside this budget had some unintended consequences, and I think the changes that we saw here were one of them. There was a lot of discussion over, what's a core department function versus what's an earmark, and I think that the Autism Navigator program being not included in this budget was an unintended consequence of some of those changes. There's always another supplemental. We've got to close the books. I'm hopeful that we'll do that by the end of the year, and we'll have an opportunity to restore funding for this program, which I know has great bipartisan support.
So one of the things we always say at the opening of every episode of MichMash is we talk about under the radar questions. Well, one of the under the radar questions I feel like here is how big is this budget actually? It's on paper, I believe, $75 billion. But there's this $9 billion that's been parked in the Department of Health and Human Services budget, as of course you know, to deal with Medicaid funding because of a variety of federal changes. And that could mean the budget's actually more than $84 billion, and actually an increase year over year. House Republicans say it's $81 billion and smaller year over year. What does the governor's office think? Is this budget bigger than last year, the same, or less?
When you include all of the funding that's in the budget and our two main Medicaid financing tools, I'm going to use some wonky acronyms here,
Go
the
for
IPA
it.
and QAP, for those who follow along, you get to $81 billion for the total budget. There's some other Medicaid financing tools that you can add into the mix that get you to a higher number. There's a lot of uncertainty in the Medicaid space right now. And this summer, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act put our Medicaid financing at risk. And basically, Michigan was in a space where the federal government could pull out the rug at any moment, and we would see $3 billion in Medicaid funding disappear. Medicaid supports more than 2 million Michiganders. That's largely pregnant women, children, seniors, and people with disabilities. And so making sure that we could continue to draw down those Medicaid dollars was a top priority for us in this negotiation. And we were able to secure basically a backup plan so that if the feds do pull the rug out on that Medicaid funding, we've got an immediate plan to transition and make sure that we draw down those dollars. So some of that is what shows up in the math that you're talking about here. But what's important is that at the end of the day, we'll be able to draw down those federal Medicaid dollars and push them out to providers across the state, including our rural hospitals and so many others that are seeing some of the impacts of federal changes to Medicaid, and make sure that we get those dollars out to serve Michiganders and into the communities across our state.
it feels like we may not know the answer to the question of year over year spending until maybe a year from now. Is that possible? Like, we're just going to have to see how much actually gets pushed out the door?
That's true. And, there's other places in the budget where we do something similar. So federal education dollars every year, they come down to the state and they get pushed out by the Michigan Department of Education to make sure that we're serving kids and schools across the state. So you're right. At the end of the year, there will be the ability to crunch some numbers and run them side by side to do a comparison. But what we did in the budget is make sure that we are pulling down all of those federal Medicaid dollars to serve Michiganders and making sure that there's no delay in getting them out to communities and people.
This year's budget process did not go the way it's necessarily meant to go, to say the least, mainly because it took far longer than the statutorily mandated deadline to pass a budget. How do you see things playing out next budget cycle, which actually starts in a few months now in February?
We actually kicked it off in the state budget office about 2 weeks ago.
Oh.
So the work on next year's budget is well underway. As you pointed out, this year's budget process was non-traditional. The process was not pretty, but we had a really great outcome at the end of the day. The governor will present her budget in early February. The legislature has a deadline in law to pass their budgets by the end of June. And so I'm hopeful next year that we follow the more traditional process. I think that's a better outcome for people across the state. We've got school districts, local governments, and higher education that have to start their fiscal year on July 1st. So I think everything works better when we follow a more traditional timeline, and that's what we will be aiming for next year.
So, Jen, on the eve of a very important football game, I thought I would close it out by noting that between you, me, and Cheyna, we have a combined 5 degrees from Michigan State University. Those the audience can see on YouTube, Cheyna's loyalties lie elsewhere. Thank you, Cheyna. But Jen, thanks for joining us on MichMash, and go green.
Go white. Thank you.